Well, Happy New Year in 2018. I hope this is going to be a year in which there are positive breakthroughs of real truths about the fact that we're not alone in this universe. And I know that there is news about pushbacks already since uh, the December 16th New York Times release and the Washington Post release of those infrared gun camera videos, which have been exciting to some people and being attacked by other people. And for those of you who are very interested in that subject, tune in tomorrow night live on Phenomena Radio that I co-host with John Burrows. Our guest is Richard Dolan, and we are going to be talking for 2 hours live on KGRA exactly about what has happened since December 16th, both the positives and the pushbacks, and some of the confusions and contradictions. So I hope to see a lot of you on Phenomenon tomorrow. Tonight, I want to start out with some news that really was fascinating to me to read today, because I did a lot of coverage on this in 2015 and a couple of updates in 2016. And that is what astronomers call the most mysterious star in the universe. And when it was first making news 2 years ago, it had this long name, KIC 8462852, which was then shortened to Tabby's star after astronomer Tabitha Boyajian at Louisiana State University. She discovered that it was dimming and brightening by large percentages. So the question was, what was happening at this star? Well, for Earthfiles, I interviewed Professor Jason Wright, an astronomer at Penn State University, who hypothesized at the time of these discoveries that there might be a huge alien-built megastructure orbiting between the sun and the planet going around for maybe collecting energy. And that would intermittently, whatever the structure was, would dim the star, and then the star would brighten. And so maybe this was going to be the first real, proof at a distance that there might be advanced life in this universe. Today, scientists have reported that in further detailed studies of blue light and red light that they have found that the blue light is blocked more than the red light during these mysterious dimming periods. And since blue light has much shorter wavelengths than red, the blue light is easier to block with something small like dust. So the new working consensus by astronomers is that the dimming and the brightening are caused by something filtering this mysterious sun's light. But that's another mystery. What is the something dusty, if it's dust, enough to filter the sun's light so dramatically? Some suggest it might be large orbiting comets going around the star, leaving these big dust trails. But Professor Wright says, quote, "We're swimming in data now, so it's going to take us a long time to get through it all," close quote. Well, whatever happens next, just tune in to my Earthfiles.com website and to Earthfiles YouTube channel, which I'm going to try to keep doing most Wednesday nights to share with you what I think is some of the most interesting news, and going back into my own historic files as I'm working on my autobiography, and it is becoming an adventure for me going through my own files. And tonight, I would like to talk with you about a report that I posted at my news website, earthfiles.com, yesterday on January 2nd, entitled Part 1, High Strangeness Insights from an MJ Insider. My source goes back to 1992 when I was living and working in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There I had several important communications from a few whistleblowers who were frustrated by this government's persistent policies of denial and essentially lies since World War II about an alien presence on this planet, in this solar system, and beyond. And it was that year that I received an August 17th, 1992 dated letter from a military man who requested anonymity. And this is the very first time that I have ever shared the content from this hard-mailed correspondence to me. Now, would it be 16 years before the first mention on the Serpo website of different alien types with different alien names. When I first saw the serpo.org, I was really taken by sort of that feeling of, well, I'm looking at it on this website. I received this letter with very similar names 16 years before. Is this possible that we are now going to enter a time where confirmation is going to come through releases about the life forms first, and the fact that our government has names for them before they've even announced officially that we're not alone in the universe? Those were questions that I wondered about in 2007 when the Serpo material came up, because I knew that I had received this letter back in 1992. Now, I'm going to later in this update go a bit into the part of the Ronald Reagan briefing that Serpo put out in a transcript. And the part I want to highlight now, because I want to go into this letter from 1992, is the word trontoloids. There were 5 extraterrestrial names given in the Serpo material and to me. And with a variation of just a letter here and there, they are essentially the same. And what I want to highlight with all of you is the fact that the characterization of what the trontoloids are is different in these 16 years. Whatever it means, it's worth sharing and getting your own feedback, because there might be somebody out there who has some firsthand information about these names, the breakdowns, the interactions with different types of non-humans with our government, even if our government still denies any extraterrestrial presence on Earth. There are sure a lot of people who have worked in the government who confirm and say and will describe their own experiences, some face-to-face with these non-humans. Now, for those who may not understand that Majestic 12 and MJ 12, when I say an insider, this is the group that was first organized by President Harry Truman in 1947 in association with what I think the whole world has heard about, the crashes of wedge-shaped aerial vehicles described as not from Earth, with retrievals of bodies that were not human in the documents, and that President Truman organized this group of 12 people who were military, science, and business leaders that he trusted. And he gave them the charge that they were to monitor and analyze everything that they could learn about the non-human or alien presence, and that they would also be involved with trying to understand the technology that was described even then as extremely advanced. Now, with that as background, this is an August 17th, 1992, typed letter to me from an MJ12 insider. Insider to me is somebody who can talk with somebody in that group. It doesn't mean they are a member of the group. It means that their work is involved doing tasks for MJ12. He begins by talking about a meeting that he had had that was extraordinary with somebody in MJ12. I ask as many questions as possible without this person in MJ12 becoming suspicious. Obviously, all the questions were not addressed. However, I feel the most important were asked, and I'm referencing and it was a communication where I had sent a lot of questions in August of 1992 about the different types that I had been hearing about with my interviews with human abductees, as well as military voices who would seek me out to ask me questions. They would be exposed to a certain amount of information, or maybe their own firsthand encounter, and then they would come to an investigative reporter like me to see if they could find out more. That has been sort of the unfolding way that whistleblowers have come to me. And he starts in this letter and breaks it down into 5 groups. Ebens. These aliens are described as follows: 3 to 4 feet tall, gray skin. However, they always wear a tight-fitting grayish-white jumpsuit. Footnote here. In my news Earthfiles, going back about probably to 2005, somewhere in there, in my archives, I have a fascinating interview with a man who had a face-to-face with who he thought was the owner of the company that he worked for. But it turned out that the man had worked at Wright-Patterson. It's a story about doing an autopsy on 2 non-humans, and that he knew firsthand that there was a man assigned with a notebook to watch what the 2 surgeons were doing in one of the 1940s, this is back to around 1947-48, to one of these Ebens, and said that the most remarkable thing, and everybody talked about it afterwards, they made a discussion about whether they were going to do a Y cut coming into this alien body or they were going to do a T cut. And they decided whatever it was, and they start with the scalpel. And the man watching to take notes to observe so that they would have an objective report of everything is the person close to who gave me this interview. The scalpel caught. It was not skin. And the surgeon looked up and said, "This is some kind of fabric and I can't cut through it." So here is this. They always wear a tight-fitting grayish-white jumpsuit. It may be one and the same. Large black eyes, small protruded nose, small openings for ears and slits for mouth. Ebens do have a robot-type creature that sometimes is seen and mistaken for the Ebens. And this is something that is so clear to me now, after 38 years of trying to get to the bottom of all this. So many of the 3 to 4 foot tall little grays around beds or coming into kitchens or any of these little ones, as far as I know, they are programmed in the android category because they may be organic, but they're robotic and programmed, and that would be in the category of androids doing work for these taller Ebens. Archeloids is the second. 5 to 6 foot tall, tan skin. Going back somewhere in the early 80s, I remember doing a long involved abduction with a woman in California. She was totally live conscious, beta consciousness in her living room. When there was a sound, and I think it was 2 beings, and they come before her in her house. And she did very good sketches of them and said their skin was tan, just like white skin would be tanned in sun. That these always wear grayish jumpsuit or 2-piece spacesuits. They have more black slanted eyes and oval heads, 4 fingers, protruded ears and nose. These aliens are distinguished by their arms having double elbows. I had heard about the double joints in non-humans from autopsies. I still don't fully understand, but I think it means that they can go 2 ways. Their feet have 4 toes, and their ankles and foot contain just 1 large bone. These aliens have the lowest IQ of all aliens that have visited Earth to date, whatever these archeoloids are. And take it with a grain of salt, because the whole point of going over this is that I'm going to talk about differences and that we're all struggling to understand the contradictions, the pushbacks. When some fact comes out, somebody else pushes back, and then somebody pushes against the pushback. What is it really hiding? Quadloids, third group. These genetically engineered creatures come in two types: insect and humanoids. The insect types are praying mantis-looking creatures. The humanoid types are the MIBs. They take on the appearance of humans. Ironically, these genetically engineered creatures, both MIB and the praying mantises, have a higher IQ than their creators. Side note there, I have been told that the praying mantis, a long time ago, back in the 80s, I was told the praying mantis was a very advanced planet-seeding creature that had been made by some civilization in Andromeda, which is a galaxy next door, and that their job is to seed and monitor and analyze planets where they are supervising life experiments. The fourth group, heplaloids. 4 to 5 foot aliens, light gray skin tone, large black eyes, double opening lids like some reptiles, 2 openings for the nose, small opening for the ears, head appears proportionally larger than the body, 4 fingers and 4 toes. And that said unisexed. And there have been these reports where talking with some people in the military who have been on retrievals, and they say you couldn't tell whether they were dealing with a male or a female. 5, the subject of what I want to go into a bit deeper in the Serpo material about the differences here, the trontoloids. 5 to 6 foot human-looking aliens with blonde hair. The females have longer hair, very slender. The eyes have invisible double opening lids. Again, that seems to be a feature of something like a reptilian, but we're headed in a different direction here. Eyes and nose similar to humans. Now, just a sidebar, because I am going to go into just the paragraphs that are relevant to what are trontoloids in the Serpo material, that is also supposed to be from firsthand sources that have either traveled in outer space and come back to talk about it, or they have done log notes. So we have sources that are talking about blondes in both cases, but the one in Serpo is disturbing. Now this letter says, because I ask, I had been told as far back as around 1980, right after A Strange Harvest came out, I had people coming at me from all over the place, and I had people who said that they had military service, and one of the themes that kept coming up was, there is a secret war. Our Earth, humanity, from World War II, they are trying to cover up knowledge about the fact that we're manipulated. It is a concocted, manipulated planet. There is a war over something, about something. It might involve us. The secret war theme I have been exposed to now since the early 1980s. So I asked a question to this insider about it, and this was what he wrote here. He features on the Ebens, the ones that have been identified the most generally as being allies to humans, but I still can remember something being written to me, but the Ebens lie to us as well. So if everybody's lying, our governments are lying about the fact that there's an alien presence, the alien presence is served by keeping what they're doing secret, and that the issue of who is telling the truth and who is not, it seems like everybody has some game of secrecy with everybody else. The war between the Ebens and the tronoloids lasted for 300 Earth years, but it took place 6,450 years ago. I would suggest to all of you, do a search on what happened on planet Earth 6,450 years ago. What was interesting to me, I don't have anything that is really definitive, but you will find that it is talking about these like cycles of long count years on our planet, and as ice ages come and go, as volcanism comes and goes, that there is a relationship to certain cycles of numbers, and the 6,450 may be one of those that relates to 13,000, which then relates to 26,000, and that's the way to think about this. Are there cycles of time related to geophysical cycles that somehow interacts or relates to an alien presence using this planet, manipulating genetic material for its own use over a very long time period? The Ebens claim territorial rights to a planet between the Ebens and the Trontoloids planet. The Ebens occupied the planet. The dispute occurred when the Trontoloids attempted to colonize the same planet. The war started and lasted 300 years, and this fits into many, many different faceted reports, books, interviews about this being Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. The binary star system that's 37.8 light years from Earth, with two systems apparently far enough apart that you can have two solar systems in separated binary stars, and that what other people have said, what abductees have said, when Betty Hill drew the map under hypnosis, it was later identified by amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish as showing Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, and planets like Epsilon Eridani, Epsilon Bootes, our own sun further away, in this cluster. And allegedly, Betty Hill saw this three-dimensional holographic map, star map, of where we are in this little arm of a bigger arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and that they were showing her what the region was, but they didn't name anything for her. That was Betty Hill's frustration, but under hypnosis, she could draw what she saw in this three-dimensional hologram. And it was Marjorie Fish who did all this laborious work with beads on strings, trying to see if they could find the area, and it was decided, Astronomy Magazine did a December 1974 issue about the fact that the Betty Hill abduction case and the Marjorie Fish trying to find a place around our region of the Milky Way that might resemble it, they came up with Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. So I think this is the area that they're talking about here. And he says 200,000 Ebens and Tronoloids died in this battle. And Linda, this isn't a lot of casualties for a 300-year war. Finally, the war ended when both sides decided to divide the new planet in half. It doesn't make any sense, but those are the words. And then he goes on to say, in 1950, EBA 1, this is the one that was taken to Los Alamos National Lab. Some of you have heard me discuss this in conferences where the short form, there was one of the military people at a crash, not in the 47, I was told it was 49, and it's a debris field. They are already seeing bodies of aliens that appear to be dead. And they're walking in the debris. This would be like Project Moondust or Pounce. These are these trained units to go out to crashes of a UFO or ETs. And this one particular man, in his mind, two things happened simultaneously, as I've been told. He heard a high-pitched like a scream, and he saw like the end of something blowing up. And it completely shocked him. And out of that shock, he felt like that his whole eye and mind were drawn to what, to him, with his human eyes, it looked like debris. He couldn't fathom where is all of this suddenly coming in his mind, and now he feels like he's being literally pulled. But he followed the pull, and then he saw glints, and they were eyes, and it was a being, and the being was alive underneath all of this crash debris, and that being was taken to Los Alamos, where it lived with this particular military man who had the ability to download and upload telepathy. And that this is the being in some of the documents that is said to have died on June 18th, 1952 of unknown causes. So in weaving all this together, these are some of the pieces that make this seem to fit some of these patterns. In 1950, EBA number 1 told us a great deal about our own solar system and about the universe. Mars did support life at one time. But the next sentence, rather than saying it was humanoid life, which seems to be a growing consensus now, that there's archaeology on Mars, this next sentence says the planet contained only animal-like creatures, similar to our dinosaurs. They lasted a few million years before they died of radiation exposure. Now, there's no explanation about what the radiation would be, but then look at John Brandenburg's work, Death on Mars, the hypothesis that because xenon-129 is 2.5 times higher in the Martian atmosphere measured than on Earth post-1945 and the end of World War II, when we had dropped 2 bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then we've had all kinds of testing. The fact that there would be 2.5 times the amount of xenon-129 in the Martian atmosphere over Earth post-1945. So that's where it's not just John Brandenburg. There are others who have heard John's presentation about hydrogen bomb explosion above the northern hemisphere in Mars and Cydonia, who have said there is a cover-up about Mars. What we need is to have a truthful, honest survey showing us what is the archaeology in Cydonia. So this mentions radiation and doesn't explain why. John Brandenburg has a hypothesis. Either way, it's talking about dinosaur reptilians on Mars, and that Neptune, which we think of as a gaseous planet, contains now an ancient alien base. Eben's forefathers built a base on Neptune to explore our solar system. Many aliens have used our moon as a base to explore Earth. In 1908, an alien spacecraft exploded 8 kilometers above Tunguska in Soviet Siberia. It was an Eben craft, this letter says. An antimatter pod was accidentally ejected into our atmosphere, which resulted in a nuclear explosion equivalent to a 1 megaton thermonuclear blast. In 1922, an Eben craft landed near Roswell, New Mexico, and left 2 robots to explore the desert area. In 1928, 6 years later, the Ebens returned and retrieved the robots. That's the 1920s. Well, it's interesting to me that the man known as Anonymous, and to me as Stein and other names, that I did a long interview with him in 1998. He actually worked for the CIA, and his cover was teaching cryptoanalysis in an army base. But he told me that he had an assignment to go to Langley, CIA, with his boss, who worked in Langley. And they went down into an archive underground at Langley, and that they had a specific assignment to look for 1920s documents about correspondence between the UK and the United States, which then there was no CIA, there was no NSA, or no DIA, there was no Department of Defense. It was called the War Office. This was even a precursor time to the OSS. But there was a letter, and they found it. And it was communication he told me that he had read with his own eyes with his boss back in the 1950s. And it said that the UK was inquiring to someone in the United States, do you have any information about the silver discs that are rising and lowering in Peenemünde in Germany? And that would be a full 15 years before, well, depending upon which year in the 1920s, but the one I've been given, be 15 years before Hitler and the Nazi concentration of saying, he said in speeches, and there were books and stuff that were written, that they were in fact obsessed with populating the earth with tall blondes, and that's what World War II was about, and Peenemünde was supposed to be being done with Allied ETs. Everybody says it sounds like science fiction. It can't be true. What if it is? Now, it goes back saying that during World War II, Ebens conducted thousands of reconnaissance flights over Europe and the Far East, but they did not interfere in the conflict. And I've been told sort of the same thing, that World War II was an extraterrestrial war fought through human bodies between reptilians and these blondes, the mysterious blondes. During the last 2,000 years that the Ebens have been exploring Earth, they have lost spacecraft, and we have recovered 3 of them. The flying craft that are located in Nevada have either been loaned to us or have been recovered, and we can fly them, but we can't understand all the instrumentation contained in the craft. Everything the aliens do on Earth is sanctioned either formally or informally by our government. I don't believe that for a second. So that's an idea of the mixture of things that might be true or untrue. But he goes on and says, to the best of my knowledge, the aliens have not purposefully killed or harmed any human beings, but, he said, they do mutilate animals. And that goes back to the creatures that fall into the animal mutilation category since at least the 1950s, where law enforcement privately came to the conclusion that the perpetrators were creatures from outer space, because if you have a 1,700-pound animal and there are no tracks anywhere in very face powdery dust, and they have the same bloodless excisions, no blood, no fluid, everything dry, animal dry, ground dry, no tracks, no blood. That's why law enforcement kept saying, whatever's happening, these animals have to be being taken and put down. And that's where that phrase came from. The perpetrators are creatures from outer space. So he says, the animal mutilations did occur and were performed by the aliens. They wanted to conduct experiments, better animals than humans. To complicate matters, to cover up the animal mutilations, our government launched a military program to test certain biological drugs on animals, and this was to cover up the alien program. I knew that back in the 80s, that when you would hear a story about a hypodermic needle or some kind of tranquilizer or silver radar chaff or any of it, associated with being stuffed down the mouths of animals or needle left in a leg. This was counterintelligence working overtime to keep the public and the media from any serious concern about mutilations being anything other than satanic cults, disease, predator, and in this case, the obvious planting of things like hypodermic needles would be in this category of what he's talking about. They to cover up the mutilations by the aliens, which I think he's asserting that it would be the Ebens, but I'm not sure. They had this so-called biological testing program to cover it up. And one of my questions, since I was exposed to that briefing paper while I was working on the Home Box Office project on April 9th, 1983, that said extraterrestrial biological entities manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien. So one of the questions I had asked was, which one? Who created Homo sapien, which would start with Lucy in Africa 2 million years ago and come up through Denisovans and Neanderthalensis and to us and all the others. There'd be all these models that were tweaked by extraterrestrials as I understood it. So in answer to my question, who created Homo sapien, this person working with and for MJ12 has a surprising answer. God did. He created the universe and all living creatures. This question cannot be easily answered. Maybe someday when you understand the entire program, you will understand this very difficult and dangerous subject. He uses the word dangerous subject, who made us. And if God made us, then why are these alien intelligences involved with manipulating genetic material on this planet and probably billions of other planets for eons? And then, believe me, when you understand the entire story, from the beginning to the end, your faith in God will be strengthened, not weakened. Your love of God will always be there, and your hate for the evil one will grow. That one sentence relates to one other description that this particular whistleblower had described for me that I brought up in the Earthfiles YouTube channel before Christmas. And that was that I had had a description that the cosmos with a capital C has as many universes as if we looked at a beach of sand and every grain was a universe. And that surrounding the island of universes was a cold, dark sea. And when I had asked for, what is that? What is the cold, dark sea? He had said that the MJ12 person that he's always referencing had told him, you don't want to know, it will change you forever. So you have all these contradictory facets. Why? Why is it so contradictory? What would be dangerous about knowing the answers to any of this? And he says, this man he was talking to was very emotional. His voice quivered. It's hard to understand what motivates him. But every time I hear him speak, I am motivated. I do not believe he will ever tell me the entire story for some reason. I feel he does not want me to know. There is fear in his voice and his eyes when he talks about the relationship between the entire story of alien intelligences in this universe and this planet and religion. There is obviously a strong relationship between the two. Now, for those of you who have read Glimpses Volume 1 and Glimpses Volume 2 of my work, you know that I did 2 prologues, one about my experiences in Peru and one about my experiences in the mountain in Idaho, and both of which involved sort of a penetrating paradigm shift for me, that there is a profound relationship between the soul, I personally think, and the force that is behind everything, and that Bohm, the physicist who wrote Wholeness in the Implicate Order, has that brilliant sentence, all mass is frozen light. And that all of this that we're talking about, in one sense, almost seems to be like shadows cast on the wall in the cave by a fire, which is the way Plato was looking at the detritus of life in the world, that there is something more profoundly important. That's what I am struggling to understand. And now, just to come full circle to where I began, that 16 years later, after this kind of correspondence and discussion with people in the 80s and into the early 1990s, that by 2007, the www.serpo.org would be putting out what is described as a March 6 to 8, 1981 briefing at Camp David for new President Ronald Reagan. And what they described in Serpo about what they were doing was, quote, the gradual release of confidential documents pertaining to a top-secret exchange program of 12 U.S. personnel who went to a planet called Serpo in the binary solar system of Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, and they stayed on the planet Serpo between 1965 to 1978. Now, for those who can remember Steven Spielberg's 1970, I think it was 1978, Encounters, the movie Encounters of the Third Kind, I think, Fourth Kind. It was where NASA type astronauts and pilots were in the orange suits and they go on this enormous UFO, that last scene, and allegedly Ronald Reagan turned to Steven Spielberg in the screening room in the White House and said, only a few of us in this room know that this scene has really happened, or some variation on that theme. So if this briefing, which a Washington insider I trust, if this is true, and this is much bigger, and you should go to Earthfiles and do a search on all of the work that I've done on tronoloids and Reagan and these briefings, and I'm just going to close out with these last insights from the alleged briefing for a president. It says that this is a transcript of classified tape recordings made at Camp David, Maryland during a presidential briefing regarding the subject of unidentified flying objects and extraterrestrial visitations of Earth. President Ronald Reagan was present. The recording was made between March 6th and 8th, 1981, close quote. In charge of this Reagan briefing were William Casey, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, working with advisors, and a caretaker protector of the extraterrestrial files. And then it goes into a lot of tremendous numbers of pages, and I'm just going to cut to the caretaker tells President Reagan, Mr. President, the 5 species of extraterrestrial biological entities that we are dealing with are called ebens, archeloids, quadloids, heptaloids, and trontoloids. My mind immediately went back 16 years to that other letter. There's just a tiny couple of letters variations on two of these names. These names were given to the alien species by the intelligence community, specifically MJ5. The ebens are friendly, the trontoloids are the dangerous ones. The caretaker said, "We call these hostile aliens simply that, HAV, hostile alien visitors." MJ12 placed that code in them back in the 1950s. And it says that the home world of the HAV trontoloids is allegedly the third planet out from the star Epsilon Eridani in the constellation Eridanus, 10.5 light years away, half the distance to Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. Although somewhat cooler and fainter than our sun, it is very similar. It is in a yellow sun spectrum. Advisor number 4. We did find some star charts in crashed craft in New Mexico. The charts were difficult to understand because they were on a block that we later figured out went into a certain panel on the crashed craft instruments. Once the panel was in place, the board showed a star system. In fact, we were able to fit all of the found boards into the panel and view many different star systems. We then put to work our astronomers in deciphering the star systems. It didn't take them very long to determine the various star systems. We also found several strange spots on the star charts, and we concluded that these spots were where the ETs travel space tunnels that one of the ebens described. Our astronomers compared the different star charts and found that they were not consecutive, meaning that one star chart was from one part of the universe and the next was a chart closer to their home system. Our scientists concluded the spots on the chart were a form of shortcuts from one point of space to another. They move point to point because they know how to fold space and time, which is consistent with Einsteinian physics. And we are stuck so far on a planet where we have to go through Euclidean geometry. We have to go a long way. We have to go 8,000 miles if we want to go all the way around the Earth. And other physicists have told me that that there are some parts of what we're doing in black projects where we are learning how to go point to point through these tunnels in space. Our scientists said that they were given only the minimum amount of information that they needed, so that they were being handled on a need-to-know basis only. And the President, Reagan, asked, "So that means the trontoloids can travel like the ebens travel, point to point?" And the advisor said, "Mr. President, they can travel in the same fashion as the ebens. However, according to the ebens, the trontoloids use a different form of propulsion, something like matter versus antimatter." And they end up, all of the caretaker and the CIA director, telling Reagan that the trontoloids are at least 1,000 years beyond us. And to bring this now down to the question that I have, and I'm curious if anybody out there listening knows anybody or you yourself, if trontoloids are blondes, one version is they are tall blondes and that they have been at war with the ebens for a very long time over the territory of a planet that appears to be in Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2. The perspective given to Reagan is that the trontoloids are insects that can hide inside of a camouflage body that is blonde, and that they are insects. That has always been very puzzling. The people in the human abduction syndrome have often talked that they knew that whatever they were dealing with at various times in whatever their drama was with an alien presence, that they knew that they could shapeshift. People have seen humans change to reptilians or various types. But the idea that there are two points of view here, that what might be primally insect that camouflages as blondes versus blondes that are a unique species that have fought the Ebens over planetary territory. Which is true? Or is it that they're both true, but when you put them together, the complexity of the idea that the blondes would have had a 300-year war with Ebens over territory on a planet, and that in other cases they either shapeshift into insects or they are insects and they shapeshift back into humans. All of this is what I have been confronting and running into now for 38 years, often shaking my head and feeling like none of this could be true. But today, as we're heading into 2018, more and more whistleblowers have come forward in the last couple of years, reinforcing a lot of this. Is the complexity, the relationship of something that has to do in a cosmic, spiritual relationship to the soul life of any life form? That something is going on in this universe that is specific and concentrated on the soul more than the container, and that we have a lot of intelligences that know more about what is going on and what is in this universe, and that their competitions with each other might even be over a planet like Earth and us. If that is the big box, then I will continue to the best of my ability to try to keep understanding what the truth is, because I can't myself think of anything that is more important to understand than what is our relationship of Homo sapiens sapien to the alien presences that are described in the private letter in an alleged briefing for President Reagan, that would say that the complexity of the phenomena and its ability to move point to point in this universe, folding space-time, moving through black holes, moving through space tunnels, you and I and every person on Earth, I think, deserves to know what is the truth. And with that, thank you for listening. It's part of my challenge is always braiding all of these pieces over such a long time period. And I'm finding that some of you have written to me and say you appreciate my trying to do this. And I know that it is a lot, and I know it can be a bit overwhelming, but I sure would like to continue to hear from any and all of you, both about your feedback on if you think that this is helpful, and if you know anybody who might be able to shed more information to me. And that it's so important right now, because even with the infrared gun camera footage, which other pilots have told me they think is absolutely legitimate, I understand now that there's even pushback on that. And if we're going to constantly, every single thing that comes out is going to get slammed because there's a war in the Pentagon over whether people should be told the truth or not, I opt for trying to go into the complexities. And hopefully this year we're going to get a huge headline around the world that, yes, scientists, Pentagon, they are confirming we're not alone in the universe. And until that point, I take some of your questions and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Hey, Linda. We have first to do a few thank yous to awesome fans who gave us super chats tonight. Kevin McBride, Stanix Cabrera, Elizabeth Luker, and Alex. Thank you so much for your support.
Yes, thank you.
So here's our first question. You sort of touched on it, and it kind of got everyone talking tonight. They asked, I know about the animal mutilations, but Linda, do you know of any recorded human mutilations?
The human mutilation question has come up many, many times since I did A Strange Harvest. And I always want to be as honest as I possibly can. I do not have any coroner's proof, a coroner or autopsy, that would put a mutilated human body into the category of all of the animals. Now, having said that, Dr. John Altshuler, who was a hematologist and pathologist who worked with me a lot in Denver, Colorado when I was there, one day I got a phone call from a family, and it was in Missouri, and they said a man has been found face down, naked, on the edge of a lake, and very rural Missouri. And we understand that there was an ear missing, eye, tongue, jaw, rectum, and these various same type of excisions that are on animals large and small. Well, it was just a phone call, and I always am trying to get documents, firsthand testimony. So I called up Dr. Altshuler. I told him, and he said, oh, I'll call the coroner. And he was a very respected hematologist, pathologist, ran his own laboratory in Denver. He should have been able to call the coroner, explain this was confidential private research, and he should have been able to get some information. And when he called me back, he said, you know, this is really puzzling. Actually, he said, it's troubling. I called, I introduced myself at his whole lab. Anybody could have found all kinds of information about the work that he did. And he said, the coroner simply said, I have no information on that case, and hung up on Dr. John Altshuler. And that was the part that shocked him, because as a very skilled, long-time professional, he was used to being able to make inquiries confidential. If somebody said to me, I'll tell you what we found confidentially, but you cannot report this, I would not report it. And I certainly would never use the names of people who didn't want to be reported. But in this case, the coroner hung up on Dr. John Altshuler in what seemed like a professional question. That raises, at least circumstantially, kind of a question about who told that coroner's office, don't talk to anybody. That was the bottom line implication. And I've run into that in sheriff's offices on animal mutilations as well. Is there any hard evidence that there have been human mutilations like the animal mutilations? If there are, and I've heard of other cases, but I've never been shown a single autopsy report, probably because if it's true that it happened, the government would make sure that nobody ever gets those autopsy reports or photographs. And so it leaves it in this strange, fuzzy area that there are anecdotal stories that have been covered in San Francisco about so-called homosexual murders where rectums were cored out, penises removed, eye removed, And there was a series of those back in the I think it was the 1960s, 60s or 70s. But there's no way that you can get a handle on something you can hold up to the New York Times and the Washington Post and say, here is the autopsy report, here is the photographs, there's no blood in the heart, there's all these things that we have found in the animals. And it's an interesting question. I remember being on a radio program with Bud Hopkins back in the late 80s, I think it was. And the interviewer asked me, if you had hard proof of a human mutilation, would you report it? And I remember, as much as I love fact and truth, I remember my mind and my heart caught on that question. And then when you go that far, and then you stand back and say, probably that question and many others are why governments have felt since World War II that they needed to keep everything about an alien presence or presences under wraps of policies of denial and lies, and that they could argue in a court of law that lying and deception and manipulation that has been done now for 70 years is defensible in the interests of protecting national security, keeping civilian peace. And those are the same arguments that I've heard for the last 3.5 decades. It just seems to me that we are at some kind of a point in the timeline where everybody has to be thinking about these questions themselves and realizing we are on a planet where we're not being told the truth about much of anything. And that when there's a lot of pushback on two sides, it's probably because there is a war in the Pentagon about whether any of this should be finally acknowledged or not. I'd love to know what you all think. I'll do one more question. I know I've gone longer than normal, but it's after the New Year and a holiday, and I just felt this was important. So one more question.
Okay, great, Linda. The next one is, I saw a humanoid shadow run across a wall in which the sun was shining. I was 7 years old. There was no one behind me, just a big open yard. I got goosebumps. What do you think of things like this? Are shadows like that related to UFOs or aliens?
Such a good question. There is a whole category in what we'll call the UFO ET phenomenon of shadow people. That's what it's called. And in my book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, which the new volume is going to be ready to ship in about 2 weeks. And it's beautiful. It has color in it for the first time. And you will be able to see a color illustration by an abductee who was an artist. And hers are some of the very best that I've ever seen. And she has you see her in her bed. You see one of the little gray, that I would call an android, right by the bed. And right behind is an opening, an oval is opening up in her room. And coming out of it are totally black shadow versions of a humanoid. So the idea that there are these shadow phenomena, it could be related to the same question of camouflage, that we are dealing with intelligences that can project holograms, that we cannot tell that they are not the tree, like the tree next to it, and that these holograms could be download information, and they could have been on this planet for 270 million years and nobody has known. It could be that there is an ability to cloak, but to cloak in different ways, to shapeshift into a different type of entity, to completely blacken so that there's no photon reflection, might be an explanation for some of these shadow people. The illusion, all of the categories and facets of illusions, even if you just go into the stories of the last 5,000 or 6,000 years of so-called modern humans, the stories of black things that show up may be in this category of restricting photons, manipulation of the human mind, being able to work directly in our occipital lobe and in various parts of our brain that would affect what we see, what we hear, being able to direct telepathy right into the language center of the human brain. It wouldn't matter what language it was, anywhere on the planet, the beings would be able to communicate directly in the language center. I think that's becoming well established. So in that, a shadow, something that looked like a shadow of some sort of a humanoid moving along a wall, there are variations on that theme throughout the UFO phenomena, and that it probably was related. And then the big question, why, to leave on tonight. Why is an alien presence itself camouflaging, sort of staying out of being front and center of an evolution of standing up humanoids on Earth, us being the current model? What is the laboratory? What is the experiment? What is the goal? Maybe at the end of 2018, we'll have more answers to that question, and I'll see you next week for another Earthfiles YouTube channel. Thanks a lot.